Welcome, everyone. I'm Penny Lewis, the Executive Director of the Ecological Landscape Alliance, and I'll be the moderator for today's webinar, Managing Land for Pollinators and Conservation Biology. As part of the Focus on Sustainability webinar series. This series was developed by a group of organizations known regionally for their quality ecological education, and by collaborating on these webinars, we expand the reach of our regional programs. In case you're not familiar with our organizations, they're largely nonprofit and volunteer groups in the United States. The regional groups are the Ecological Landscape Alliance, the Chesapeake Conservation Landscaping Council, the Illinois Landscape Contractors Association Sustainability Committee, the Kansas City Native Plant Initiative, and Rescape California. If you have a question for the presenter, you may ask it by typing in the question box at any time during the broadcast, and we'll be addressing all of your questions at the end of the presentation. And now I would like to introduce our presenter, Emily May. Emily is the Pollinator Conservation Specialist for the Xerces Society for Invertebrate Conservation. She received a master's in entomology from Michigan State University and has studied pollinator habitat restoration, bee nesting habitats, and the effects of pest management practices on wild bee communities. Her work with Xerces for the past several years has focused on supporting crop pollinators through habitat creation and by mitigating pesticide risks to bees and other beneficial insects. Emily is based in Connecticut and provides technical assistance for pollinator projects in Vermont, Massachusetts, and New Hampshire. Welcome, Emily.
Thank you so much, Penny, for having me here. I just wanted to clarify, we're talking about managing land for pollinators and conservation biocontrol, which is the pest control services provided by wild beneficial insects. But I'm happy you're all here today to listen in. So as Penny said, I'm a pollinator conservation specialist with Xerces Pesticide program, and I do a lot of work in the Northeast, but also work with field staff across the country. Xerces has been around for about almost 40 years now, working towards protecting wildlife through the conservation of invertebrates and their habitat. And we have field staff in over 12 states working on pollinators and agricultural biodiversity. A lot of our work is in education and outreach, and we've done education to over 80,000 farm and agency professionals over the last 10 years, including trainings in all 50 states. And our work has led to the creation of over 500,000 acres of habitat for pollinators in the US through our work with the USDA Natural Resource Conservation Service to implement pollinator habitat through the Farm Bill. So I'll be here talking to you today about pollinators and other beneficial insects, how we can manage landscapes for those insects, some of the challenges that they're facing, and how habitat is really the solution. Habitat that's protected from pesticides is the solution for many of these insects. So I'll just dive right in. Beneficial insects, which include pollinators, represent a large percentage of the insect population. Really only a small fraction of the insects around the globe are pests, as we think of them. The rest provide some benefit to humans or are important for food webs and other wildlife. So pollinators are what I focus most of my time on. More than 85% of flowering plants require an animal, which is chiefly insects, to move pollen from the male to the female parts of the flower in order to set seeds and fruit. And those pollinated plants are really important for human health and our diets, as well as other wildlife. So pollination is an ecological service that's essential to a substantial portion of the food that we consume. About 35% of crop production worldwide either depends on or benefits significantly from pollination by insects. And the value of these crops ranges from 18 to about 27 billion in the US and many billions of dollars worldwide. Importantly, the most nutritious parts of our diet, fruits and vegetables, are the products that are most dependent on insect pollination. The majority of minerals, vitamins, and nutrients that we need to maintain our health, like vitamin C and calcium, come from crop plants that depend partially or fully on animal pollinators. And importantly, things like coffee and chocolate are also pollinated by insects. So this is what your produce store might look like with pollinators, what you might walk in there today. This is what it might look like without pollinators. So life would be very different and much less colorful. There's many different kinds of insects that provide pollination, butterflies and moths, flies, beetles. All of these move from flower to flower and can transfer some pollen. But some insects are much better at pollination than others. Bees are our most efficient pollinators because they are actively going out to collect and transport pollen. They use it to feed their offspring. So they are much better pollinators. They're hairy. They have these structures on their body that are meant for carrying pollen. So they're generally much better pollinators than other insects that go from flower to flower. Bees also learn to handle flowers as they go out and forage for pollen. So they exhibit flower constancy, meaning that they are often transferring the same species of plants pollen between the same species, right? Not bringing in pollen from other species of plants, which can't germinate and develop into a seed or fruit. They're also what's known as central place foragers. So they're foraging in an area around a nest site. They found that nest and then they move around going out on pollen foraging trips and then coming back to their nest site. So if you have them on your property, they're likely pollinating flowers in that general vicinity. So if you can support nest sites and habitat close by to pollinator-dependent plants, like some certain crops, the bees will be visiting the area around those nest sites and habitat. So if our goal is to help biodiversity conservation while also helping other insect-pollinated crop production, we should really be focusing on bees, who can serve as an umbrella for many other pollinator groups as well as other beneficial insects. The pollinator you might be most familiar with is the European honeybee, which is our #1 agricultural pollinator, but it's actually not native to the United States. And it's facing many challenges, diseases, parasites, the varroa mite in particular. So beekeepers are struggling to keep up with the demand for pollination. But most of what I'm going to be talking about here is how we can be supporting the many other species of bees in the landscape. And there's nearly 3,600 species of native wild bees in the United States, which are contributing to the pollination of both agricultural crops and wild plants in the landscape. And these are the ones that I'm really thinking about today. Wild pollinators are super important for a lot of different crops. They, in a big meta-analysis of different cropping systems, it was found that wild pollinators actually improved fruit set of those crops at twice the rate of honeybees, and more diverse wild pollinator communities produced more and higher quality fruits, nuts, and vegetables. This is a photo of a mining bee on a true fruit, and mining bees are really important early season pollinators and really efficient pollinators of apples and pears and cherries. But I'm also going to be talking today about other beneficial insects. There's many other beneficial insects that provide really important ecosystem services in the form of pest control. These natural enemies, or biocontrol agents as they're sometimes called, help regulate insect pests. There are some that are predators, others are parasitoids, and they can be generalists on a variety of different insects or specialists. I just wanted to point out how cool this upper right insect is. This is a masked hunter bug. It's called masked because the nymphs use their hind legs to camouflage themselves with dust or sand grains to help them hunt prey. So they'll hunt bed bugs and other prey at night. Down here on the left-hand side, we have a tobacco hornworm moth that's been parasitized by a Burkina wasp. And so by the time those young wasps have pupated, they will have killed that host, which is a pest of a variety of crops. This estimate here, the estimated value of pest control by wild beneficial insects in the billions of dollars for US crops and in the many billions of dollars globally, is from a study that looked at the broader impacts of wild insects on society, including pollination and wildlife nutrition. This estimate is based really on the available data and information. So in many ways, knowing how valuable these pest control services are can provide justification for conserving and enhancing those insects worldwide. Oftentimes, these insects are not the most visible. So take, for example, this minute parasitoid wasp attacking a mottled tortoise beetle. We have many of these insects out here, and they're not the most visible. You know, bees are a visible insect providing a visible service. Some of these insects that are providing important pest control services, keeping pest populations lower, are not very visible. But they come in all shapes and sizes. So beneficial insects are super diverse in terms of the stage that feeds on prey insects, how they move, how they're utilizing their prey, where they're overwintering. So I'll go through a few of these major players here. Lacewings on the left and lady beetles in the middle have somewhat similar life histories. Both of these insects go through full metamorphosis, meaning their adult life stage looks nothing like their immature larval stage. You're probably most familiar with most familiar with the adult lacewings or lady beetles, the delicate transparent wings of the lacewings, the characteristic brown, shiny red or black lady beetle. But it's actually their predatory larval stage that provides the best pest control. Lacewing larvae are nicknamed aphid lions for the carnivorous damage they can inflict on aphid and other soft-bodied insect populations in crop fields or gardens. A single lacewing larvae can eat more than 400 aphids a week. Likewise, the orange and black lady beetle larvae, sometimes nicknamed garden alligators, are voracious predators of aphids, scales, whiteflies, and mites. Lady beetle adults also feed on insects, but the adults of these insects also feed on pollen and nectar and honeydew. So there's an opportunity to support them in that reproductive stage with flowering resources. Adults of lacewings and lady beetles will overwinter in places like leaf litter or under bark or in the surface layer of soil. On the right is an ichneumon wasp, which is a parasitoid wasp that lays its eggs in this case, a caterpillar. Many parasitoids are host-specific on various types of insects, including caterpillars, grasshoppers, aphids, sawflies, mealybugs, scales, whiteflies, beetles. The list goes on. But on the bottom right is a picture of aphid mummies, which is an adult female parasitoid wasp that laid its eggs in these aphids. The larvae hatched and developed inside the aphids and eventually killed them. When the wasp larvae complete their development, they pupate and turn the aphid into this sort of swollen brownish mummy. So you'll see these scattered in or in clumps with existing aphid populations. And sometimes you can even see where the aphid parasite chewed its way out of the mummies. But again, adult wasps are typically feeding on nectar to keep their energy up through the reproductive stage. So there's an opportunity to support them with flowering plants. This is another kind of awesome beneficial insect, predatory ground beetles. They're some of the most common and voracious beneficial insects. And like all beetles, they go through full metamorphosis, but unlike lacewings and lady beetles, they remain predatory through these different life stages. So see this adult here, keep that in your mind for a second. And this is what the larva of a crabid beetle looks like. So if you look at those mandibles, that beetle is just ready to eat some prey. But ground beetles don't just eat soft-bodied insects. Some omnivorous species also consume seeds and pollen, sometimes detritus, and they can play an important role in managing weed seed banks. So there's several specialist species that feed on the seeds of weeds like lamb's quarter and ragweed. So they're playing multiple important roles in the ecosystem. And then we have some overachievers in terms of beneficial insects. These beneficial insects provide several important ecosystem services. So hoverflies, adult hoverflies are pollinators moving between flowers, often sort of on flat-topped umbelled flowers or asters. But they're also voracious predators as larvae and can serve as larvae. And a single larvae can eat hundreds of aphids in a week. So they are overachievers throughout their life stages. But both pollinators and other beneficial insects are facing some challenges. We are seeing an unprecedented scale of habitat loss for insects, over 20 million acres, and this estimate may have changed by now, but over 20 million acres of grassland and prairie have been converted to cropland since 2008. That doesn't even include the millions of acres of wetlands and shrublands that have also been converted to croplands over the last 10 years. But looking broadly across the United States, it's the largest conversion of habitat to cropland since just before the Dust Bowl. Other concomitant changes in agricultural landscapes are also happening as we go up in scale. So removing fence rows and hedgerows to enlarge field sizes, create economies of scale, get bigger equipment in there. It reduces insect habitat in the landscape. These large blocks of crops really can't support the same biodiversity as crops that were in smaller fields surrounded by diverse tree lines and hedgerows. And we're seeing similar things happening in urban areas. We're losing habitat to urbanization, the expansion of cities. And intact habitat is often very fragmented and disconnected, often limited to riparian zones and parks, sometimes backyard gardens as well. But much of this is being pushed out and created into buildings and lawns and other settled environments. Meanwhile, insects are being exposed to a variety of chemicals across the landscape. Many insects are very vulnerable to pesticide exposure. Either it has effects, killing them immediately, but it can also be subtler, sublethal effects like changes in foraging behavior or reproduction, or the ability to fight off disease and pathogens. So one thing that you may have heard in relation to pollinators is about neonicotinoids, which is a class of insecticides that's water soluble, so it's highly mobile in the environment and systemic and can be taken up into plants. These chemicals can be very persistent once they've been taken up in a woody plant, for example, or in soil, and they're highly toxic to bees and many other beneficial insects. They're used as coatings on seeds of corn and soybean and some other crops, and they are used prophylactically in this sense, meaning they are used often without a demonstrated need. People will plant them not knowing whether a pest is actually present in that field. So this persistence and high toxicity means it's a long-term exposure risk for bees and other beneficial insects. And just to give you a sense of the scale of this, this is the estimated use of imidacloprid, which is the most common neonicotinoid, back in the 1990s, early 1990s, when it was first introduced, I think in cotton. Here's 1997, 2004, 2009, and the most recent year in which this information was collected. Increased use in the central states is largely due to increased use of imidacloprid in soybeans as a seed treatment, which has been shown to be often ineffective and has trophic effects on other pests. There was research out of Penn State finding that use of neonics treatments in soybeans actually led to a secondary outbreak of slugs in the field. So, but you can see there's widespread landscape scale use of these chemicals, and there's high potential for bees and other beneficials to be exposed. So bees and beneficials are facing many challenges, and one of them is this use of insecticides across the landscape. But there are solutions, and they start with habitat. Habitat is the key ingredient for pollinators and natural enemies. Many studies, study after study, are showing a direct link between the provision of diverse flowering habitat and beneficial insect abundance and diversity. You get really cool insects once you put habitat in the landscape. Here's a great golden digger wasp, which is sipping nectar. So what is habitat? Habitat means food, so pollen and nectar, or in the case of beneficial insects, a place where they can find alternative prey. It also means shelter, so areas for overwintering sites, egg-laying sites, or in the case of bees, nesting sites, and refuge from pesticides, so a clean area where they can receive refuge from pesticide exposure that they might be receiving elsewhere in the landscape. So in terms of food, many beneficial insects rely on pollen or nectar at specific periods of their life cycle, or they can use these floral resources to supplement their diets when insect prey is not available. All pollinators need nectar or pollen from flowers to complete their life cycle. So for this reason, it's important that pollinator habitat contains a diversity of native plants that provide a succession of bloom throughout the growing season, so overlapping with many different kinds of pollinators' active flight periods. And as much as possible, also bringing in a diversity of flowering plants will help support the greatest diversity of pollinators and other beneficial insects. That can mean different shapes and sizes, colors, flower shapes. Habitats are also a harbor for alternative prey when crop pests are absent. So here's a lady beetle larva feeding on an oleander aphid. Habitat also means providing shelter. So in the case of wild bees, roughly 70% of wild bees are nest underground. So most of these bees are solitary females going in and out, forming their nest, coming back to the nest with pollen and nectar, and then laying eggs on these round balls of pollen and nectar. This on the left-hand side is an underground bee nest, and you can see at the bottom there what that pollen and nectar provision with a little bee larva on top of it looks like. Some of these bees nest communally, so sort of apartment style with a single entrance and then multiple apartments below, but are foraging by themselves. And many of these bees are lining their nests with waxy secretions that resist moisture and flooding. So habitat can provide that important undisturbed nesting area for bees and other insects that build their houses underground. The other 30% of native bees nest in hollow plant stems or wood or cavities. So on the right here, you can see that's a Ceratina, a little small carpenter bee poking her head out of a raspberry cane or a blueberry cane, I'm not sure. But they build these tunnel nests where they've partitioned these nest cells with provisions, pollen and nectar, lay an egg on top of it, partition, start another cell. So leaving dead standing wood or having some hollow stemmed or pithy stemmed plants that these bees can excavate is another important piece of habitat for wild bees. For beneficial insects, brush piles, bunch grasses, decaying logs, again, this important undisturbed habitat for overwintering insects, and as well as locations for egg laying throughout the year. A brush pile can provide some of these more important protected habitat structures. Old hollow stems from previous year's plants could also be important nest-making habitat, like this nesting isodontia wasp here, which is a grasshopper hunter. Many surface-dwelling invertebrates rely on plant residue for protection from the elements, and as well as from predators. So practices that provide some ground cover can be important, whether it's in a natural prairie or a cropland or a forest. So if you look around the space that you're managing, you may already have pretty good pollinator and other beneficial insect habitat, areas with flowering plants, flowering trees and shrubs, whether those areas are managed or fallow, some decaying trees or snags. For some bees, they like to have a little bit of a patch of warm, bare soil that they will excavate out to form that underground nest, but also having some leaf litter and plant residues as a ground cover for other beneficial insects that like having that leaf litter to make their nests in is important. So a bit of diversity on ground cover can be a good thing. Our process when we're going out to a site to think about how can we improve this for pollinator habitat is to start by recognizing what's already there. And we have these habitat assessment guides that are available on our website, both for pollinators and beneficial insects, mostly in farm and agricultural landscapes that they're focused on. But they can help as a sort of checklist and a guide for thinking about what's already there and what you might need to improve on. What are some gaps maybe in bloom throughout the season that you might want to plug in with some plants that bloom in early spring or late fall. And that can help you prioritize habitat improvements on the landscape. This could be a total spectrum of approaches. So from protecting existing naturally diverse areas, which isn't always easy, there might be some serious invasive management that needs to happen, to adding flowering plants, changing pest management practices to better protect insects, to sort of the most intensive establishment of native hedgerows or wildflower meadows. And I've sort of listed this as a spectrum, but some might be more easy or less easy depending on your context. And really, I think we'd like to see these as interconnected pieces. So protecting existing habitat might include, or hopefully will include, in changing pest management practices to better protect insects. And I will be talking about that in my last module at the end of this. Part of developing new habitat for beneficial insects includes selecting some plants to put in. For bees, you may be thinking, well, what kind of plants support bees? Some bees are generalists, meaning they'll forage on a whole bunch of different kinds of flowers. And some are more specialized, meaning they like to feed their young on a particular kind of pollen from a particular species or suite of or family of species. And those pollen specialists might be rare or abundant, depending on the abundance of their host plant in the landscape. So some are really common, like the squash bee, which feeds its young on squash pollen. They're pretty abundant where we have planted squash out in the landscape. But in general, I would say most bees will forage on more than one type of plant. And as long as we're doing a good job planting a diversity of different types of bee attractive plants that bloom at different times through the season, we should do a pretty good job supporting a diversity of bees. So a good starting point is our website has regional lists of pollinators supporting native plant species that are just a starting point to think about plants that will support a good number of different kinds of bees. It's a little more complicated for butterflies and moths, many of which require very specific host plants. So if you're interested in supporting butterflies and moths, the Lady Bird Johnson Wildflower Center has some great plant lists which include host plants for butterflies, and they also have great lists for other pollinators and beneficial insects. So it's a good place to look if you're interested in supporting that kind of pollinator. One thing to think about if you're going to a nursery or another place that sells transplants, to avoid cultivated plant varieties in general. Garden varieties like double-petaled ornamental varieties can look really nice, but they might offer little or no nectar or pollen. Often when you're substituting stamens for those petals, so you're losing your forgive me, you're losing the pollen source that those plants provide. So look for locally sourced, native, pesticide-free plants or seeds, sort of as a rule of thumb for if you're trying to support pollinators in your backyard garden or in a commercial planting. Early spring blooming trees are a really important pollen source for bees that come out at the beginning of the year. And often these are overlooked when we're thinking about putting in, a season-long forb planting. But these are great resources for mining bees and bumblebees that come out early and need pollen immediately for supplying their first brood. So willows and maples, cherries, serviceberry, hawthorn, there's lots of different examples, but these are really important resources for pollinators in the landscape. And look how happy that mining bee looks on that willow. It's just covered in pollen. So I want to end this section about creating habitat with a case study, which just is one example from many showing the value of supplying flowering plants for beneficial insects. So I'm sure many of you are familiar with the brown marmorated stink bug, which is an important invasive pest that's been moving slowly westward in the US. And it's been a challenging pest to figure out how to control because it's such a generalist and it feeds on a lot of different kinds of plants. So this native sand wasp feeds on true bugs, and it's been found, this was research out of Penn State, it was found that brown marmoratids are actually a favorite prey of this wasp, with a single female able to kill up to 40 brown marmorated stink bugs to feed her offspring in her lifetime. So these wasps are found east of the Rockies, and adult wasps will feed on flowers like mountain mint and spotted bee balm while collecting stink bugs to provision their nest. So this was research from Penn State figuring out how can we support these sand wasps in their predation of brown marmoratids while we should provide them with some alternative forage sources and hopefully boost predation of brown marmoratids in crop fields where these mountain mints and spotted mints have been planted. So just in this last section, I want to highlight some of the risks of pesticides to bees, and then think about how can we protect that habitat, which we have now invested in, from pesticide exposure. How can we keep pollinators and beneficial insects happy in that habitat, rather than creating sort of a sink where we've attracted these insects in, but then they're receiving pesticide exposure and are the worse for wear. There's a wide variety of pesticides, including insecticides, fungicides, and herbicides that can harm pollinators and other beneficial insects, either directly or indirectly. There's lots of different ways that insects can be exposed to pesticides across the landscape. They might experience direct contact from a spray, or some post-spray contact with residues on foliage, or in contaminated pollen and nectar, contaminated nesting materials. Some of those tunnel nesting bees that nest above ground partition their nests with leaf materials. So leafcutter bees will make nest partitions out of the leaves of a lot of different kinds of plants. But if they're collecting contaminated nesting materials and bringing them back into the nest, that means that larvae might be exposed from a pretty young age to those pesticides. Given that many bees and other beneficials nest either at the soil surface or below ground, they have been found nesting in crop fields. So they may be experiencing some exposure at their actual nest site if it's located in a treated area. So there's lots of different ways that bees might be exposed to pesticides across the landscape. But our approach to minimizing pesticide risk really starts with a preventive pest management approach. So reducing reliance from the get-go on chemical controls. Integrated pest management, or IPM, is one approach to managing pests that focuses on preventing pest problems from occurring in the first place, which is done by relying on a number of different management strategies, biological, cultural, mechanical, that are available, and only using pesticides when there's a demonstrated need for further action. So a pest is present at harmful levels. So really this is getting at addressing the root problems that cause pest pressure, unlike pesticides, which are really responding to the symptom, which is the pest. So because it reduces, hopefully, when applied correctly, reduces pesticide use, IPM can act as a framework to design crop protection or plant protection methods that reduce risk to pollinators and other beneficial insects. So this is what that sort of prevention, we have the food triangle with things we should do a lot of at the base and then things we should do less of at the top. So prevention in the pest management sense includes thinking about resistant varieties, rotation of plants, conservation biocontrol, as we've been talking about today, maintaining good plant health. And that's really the base of this triangle, moving up into sort of scouting, monitoring, mating disruption, and then only moving into chemical controls and augmentation biocontrol, or the release of a biocontrol agent for pest management when an intervention is deemed necessary. That first step of preventing pest problems starts with healthy plants and soils. So healthy soils make healthy plants, and healthy plants have increased resiliency to pests. So achieving optimum plant health, that means that plants will be better able to tolerate pest pressure than a stressed or an unhealthy plant. So things like fertility and water that keep plants healthy. This means also choosing the right plant for the right place. So if you're planning out habitat for pollinators, selecting well-adapted varieties for the site conditions, selecting disease or insect-resistant varieties, planting them at the right time, and purchasing plants that fit into the site when they reach mature size so they're not crowding out for light and other nutrients. Step 2, after prevention sort of has been taken, step 2 of IPM is scouting and monitoring. So looking to see when and what pests and beneficials are present, doing a good job with some insect identification, and your local extension service and master gardeners can help with that. This knowledge is useful for informing those pest management strategies. And then step 3 of IPM is using preset thresholds for action. So you know what you have, you know how much you have. what level of pest pressure is going to cause enough economic damage to justify an intervention with a chemical. And again, local extension and IPM experts can help determine thresholds. I've put a couple logos here of things that are local to me in the Northeast. UMass has great resources around IPM and setting thresholds for different crops and plants. But if you're elsewhere in the country, there's other resources out there. Look for your local extension service to help with IPM. So with a solid foundation of farm practices that develop resiliency against pests, pesticides can be a shrinking part of management practices, but there still may be times when a pesticide could be part of your management regime. So the next few slides are going to discuss ways that we can mitigate risks that they pose. So once we've figured out that there might be a pest we need to manage for, using only when there's that demonstrated need. We know exactly what we're treating and we know exactly what level it's present at. Then finding a product that we can use in a targeted way, like a spot spray or an injection. This photo demonstrates a way to get an herbicide directly into an unwanted woody plant by scarring the bark, so the herbicide goes right into the vascular system of that plant, which can reduce off-site movement of pesticides. It might also mean targeted use might also mean using only in areas where the pest is present as compared to a whole field. And always reading labels carefully and following advisory language. This might seem obvious, but maybe not. Don't spray flowering plants. This is the most likely way to expose pollinators to a pesticide. They're also used by many other beneficial insects, and so protecting blooms from pesticides that can harm insects. So solutions might be to create no spray buffers or setbacks around flowering plants, or to, if a spray is needed, for example, let's say we have a crop field with flowering understory plants, mowing those plants down before making a crop field application would be one example of a way to mitigate risk. And then choosing among different alternatives that are perhaps less toxic than the most toxic option. So there's a few resources that can help with this. There's How to Reduce Bee Poisoning from Pesticides, which is a great document from Oregon State that's also available as an app, which provides an overview of how pesticide applications affect bees and then ranks different pesticides by their toxicity to bees. And then University of California IPM Online has a great online tool called the Bee Precaution Pesticide Rating, if you Google that, which includes an interactive website with product-specific information on toxicity and, importantly, information on potentially harmful mixtures. So things to not apply at the same time together because they might together increase risk. And just to note here that organic approved pesticides are not risk-free. There's some examples of organic pesticides, pyrethrins and spinosad, very commonly used, both highly toxic and broad spectrum, so they're highly toxic to bees and many other beneficials. But unlike some conventional insecticides, they are short-lived in the environment. They break down readily. So for example, once spinosad has dried, it's much less toxic than when it's initially applied. But using caution there, and also using caution with some of the newly developed microbial insecticides for which there hasn't been much toxicity testing as of yet. Fungicides are another example of a pesticide that was long believed to not pose very much risk to bees and other beneficial insects because they don't often have much direct toxicity. But what's not captured in that toxicity testing that's done for honeybees by the EPA is synergy with other pesticides as well as subtler sublethal effects. So when applied together, certain fungicides can increase the toxicity of certain insecticides. So tank mixing them together creates this synergistic impact on pollinators. Fungicides also, they're used ubiquitously, they're very common, sometimes even during crop bloom. And there's increasing evidence that some fungicides can impact bees' immunocompetence, meaning they can't fight off disease and pathogens quite as well. A fungicide exposure might increase their susceptibility to certain gut pathogens. So there's still a lot that we have to learn about other pesticides, especially ones that have sort of not been met well by the current toxicity testing regimen. For habitat specifically, we're wanting to create clean, unsprayed habitat. If you're putting a wildflower meadow in somewhere that's close to or adjacent to a treated area, if at all possible, we want to put in either an unsprayed buffer or a setback that would help prevent drift from getting onto those flowering plants. If if there's not, it's not possible to put 40 to 60 feet between your meadow and a crop field, thinking about some kind of vegetative barrier that's not attractive with some dense vegetation that can capture that drift is a good alternative. There's significant variability in how pesticides move in the environment, how long they stay active. So spatial and vegetative buffers aren't expected to eliminate pesticide contamination of pollinator habitat, but hopefully they can work in conjunction with other IPM efforts to maintain habitat that supports abundant and diverse beneficial insect populations. And finally, there's some specific efforts gardeners can take for pollinators. We know from work in the UK that backyard gardens can be incredibly important for foraging and nesting habitat for pollinators. So urban landscapes have the potential to provide pollinators and other beneficials with food and shelter. And keeping those habitats as pesticide-free as possible is an important component of pollinator protection. We have lots of resources on our website around pollinator-friendly plantings, regional plant lists, wildflower establishment, pretty much anything you might need to know around pollinators. We may hopefully already have some kind of handout we can provide you with. We also have a few books. There's print publications that you can order from our main office, but almost everything else is available for download from our website, which is www.xerces.org. We also have a few publications specifically around beneficial insects if you're really interested in conservation biocontrol and pest control services. Farming with Beneficial Insects is our recently released book around ecological pest control. And with that, I'd just like to thank all of the support that we receive from Xerces Society members. We're a member-supported organization, and we also receive funding from a variety of different sources, federal and private. So thanks so much for coming and visiting with us at this webinar. If you have questions, again, you can type them into the question box here. If we can't get around to all of your questions, you can feel free to reach out to me or to our main office.
All right, thank you so much, Emily. We do have a few questions. The first is, has Xerces published any research on the different pollinator support provided by species native plants versus cultivars?
So we have not, but there are, so there's a few researchers who have worked at looking at how attractive different plant species are to pollinators. There's been research from Michigan State that did a common garden experiment with upwards of 50 different plant species, comparing them for attractiveness to pollinators. And some of that is available at nativeplants.msu.edu. I don't know to what extent they were comparing, nativars with native species. There has been some research from University of Vermont looking at that, but we haven't published those, out of Xerces. We basically take what university partners have published and then work that into our resources around providing habitat for pollinators.
All right, thank you. Can you describe the recommendations to keep leaves and other dried materials in gardens for overwintering beneficials?
Yeah, so oftentimes, there's the desire at the end of the season. We're coming to that end of the season, wanting to clean up the yard and make it look nice. But to what extent we can leave that leaf litter over the winter and only really clean up towards the beginning of the next season, or even, leave it all together as a mulch, that's going to be better for those overwintering insects Because if you bag it up and take it away, you've probably bagged up and taken away a lot of your beneficial insects. But there's a much more detailed blog post on this that was just published on the Xerces website. So if you go to our website and Google "leave the leaves," there's pretty detailed information on leaf litter recommendations.
Excellent, thank you. Where can we find the habitat assessment guides that you mentioned?
Those are also available on the Xerces website. So if you Google Xerces Habitat Assessment Guide, it should pop right up.
All right. The next is a specific plant question. Do Carex species have pollinator value?
That is a great question. I think there are some species that that visit sedges, but I am not. I don't know if there are certain species that might be more attractive than others. That's a great question, but I'd have to look into that because I haven't given it much thought.
All right. Is there a general guideline for the minimum number of plants of a specific plant species that should be installed in a landscape to begin to attract beneficials?
That is a great question. And actually, I would love to add a slide about that in my next presentation about this. It'd be generally, I recommend clumping around 3 to 5 plants of the same species together. It helps provide pollinators with that sort of overhead view. You know, as they're flying over a planting, they can zero in on that resource and then just go flower to flower on those 3 to 5 plants. So just planting a single flower means that you know, a pollinator visiting that patch might have a hard time getting enough resource from just that single plant. Clumping them together can help them zero in and provide them with enough resource for their foraging trip.
So the next question is along the same lines. With the new recommendations for planting in plant communities where many species are intermingled, if you have sufficient numbers of plants, would planting in the plant communities versus in blocks have detrimental effect on the pollinators?
I mean, if you have, so if you're planting, you know, so for example, in my front yard, I have planted out clumps of 3 to 5 plants of a single species together, which just helps sort of pollinators move from plant to plant really easily. But in a wildflower meadow, that's not going to be the case, right? Let's say you've just sown a bunch of seed out into a meadow, it's going to come up where it's going to come up. And I don't think that's detrimental to pollinators as long as they have enough of that species that they can forage on. So yeah, if you are planting, you know, very deliberately in clumps, that can be good for them zeroing in on the resource, but I don't think it's going to be detrimental in any way to have it planted out, you know, intermingled, because that's how they would experience it in a meadow.
All right. The next question is a departure. Does Xerces have any published research on glyphosate and products such as Roundup on pollinators or humans?
Great question. We are working on some guidance around herbicide use specifically in the context of restorations, but you probably saw the recent headlines around glyphosate in bees, which was looking at some of the effects that glyphosate and potentially some other herbicides might have on gut microbiota. So we're definitely keeping abreast of the latest research about that, and hopefully we'll be able to get out some guidance around it in the next year or so.
All right, thank you. Do you know if BT used on vegetable gardens or milky spore used for Japanese beetle grubs in lawns present hazards to beneficial insects or native pollinators?
So BT is it's a bacterium that is a stomach poison but it's very specific to orders of insects, right? So depending on the strain of BT that you're applying, the typical strains are targeted at butterflies and moths, so they are going to be practically non-toxic to bees and beetles and other insects that are outside of Lepidoptera, but they may be toxic to some non-target butterflies and moths. So there's definitely reason to use some caution around there if you're concerned about non-target effects on butterflies. For milky spore, I don't think it's very specific to the Japanese beetle. So I don't anticipate there being any toxicity issues for bees or other beneficials.
All right, and we have just one final question. Can small urban habitats such as rooftop gardens, decks, or sidewalk strips provide significant benefit to pollinators in urban settings?
Yes, I think definitely, especially in aggregate, right? So one single plant might not be providing that much benefit, but in aggregate, having, pots of these flowering plants around urban settings can be a really important resource. And we have seen some evidence of that from the UK, where they were surveying backyard gardens and figuring out just how important those country gardens were or backyard gardens, were for bumblebees in particular. So yes, definitely plant plants where you can put them.
Excellent. Well, thank you for all of this information, sharing the importance of pollinators and what we can do to support them. So again, thank you so much, Emily, for sharing this important information.
Thank you so much for having me.
Good day and good gardening to you all.